My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old. And this is the story of how a so-called family intervention revealed how far my stepmother was willing to go to isolate me from everyone I loved. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. I used to believe the word intervention meant concern. It sounded serious but caring, like people stepping in because they loved you and wanted to help. I didn't know then that it could also be used as a weapon. I didn't know that someone could disguise control as compassion and call it family support. I found that out on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sitting on my parents' couch, while my stepmother smiled at me like she was doing me a favor. To understand how it got that far, you need to know a little about my family. My dad remarried when I was 19, just after I moved out for college. His new wife, Linda, was polished, organized, and very good at appearing kind. She remembered birthdays, sent thank you cards, and always volunteered to host holidays. Everyone praised her for bringing stability. After my mom passed away years earlier, I wanted to like her. For a long time, I tried. At first, the changes were subtle. Linda suggested I call before visiting, even though I always had. She commented on how often I saw my friends, how busy I seemed, how little time I spent with family. When I laughed it off, she smiled and said she was just worried about me burning out. My dad backed her up without thinking much about it. "She means well," he'd say. And I believed him. Then came the concern about my job. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which Linda didn't consider a real career. She'd ask how long I planned to live like that, hopping between projects, working late hours, meeting clients at coffee shops. When I defended myself, she'd tilt her head and say, "I'm just thinking about your future." Somehow, every conversation ended with me feeling irresponsible and small. Here's where things got complicated. Around that time, I started dating Mark, someone steady and kind who treated me like an equal. Linda disliked him immediately. She said he was too distracting and hinted that he didn't have my best interests at heart. She told my dad Mark was pulling me away from my family. Suddenly, dinners I missed became evidence against me. Time spent happy became proof I was being manipulated. I didn't know it then, but Linda was building a story about me. One where I was overwhelmed, confused, and incapable of making good decisions on my own. She shared her worries with relatives, with family friends, even with my dad's coworkers. Always gently. Always out of concern. By the time I realized people were looking at me differently, the narrative was already set. The intervention itself happened without warning. Linda invited me over for lunch, saying she wanted to talk. When I walked into the living room, my dad, my aunt, and my older cousin were sitting there, serious and quiet. My stomach dropped. Linda closed the door behind me and told me to sit. That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. She started speaking first, calm and rehearsed. She said they were worried about my isolation, about how I was pulling away and making choices that didn't align with who I used to be. She talked about stress, about bad influences, about how hard it must be for me to admit I needed help. Everyone nodded, as if this was already agreed upon. I tried to speak, but Linda gently raised her hand. "Please, Emily," she said, "just listen." And in that moment, surrounded by people I trusted, I realized this wasn't about helping me at all. It was about controlling the story. That afternoon changed everything. I didn't know it then, but that moment would define everything that followed. Sitting there, hands folded in my lap, I felt like a defendant who hadn't been told what crime she was accused of. Linda spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she was unquestionably right. She explained that the intervention wasn't an attack, but an act of love. According to her, everyone in the room had noticed changes in me. I seemed distant, defensive, secretive. She said those words slowly, carefully, like she was laying evidence on a table. My dad avoided my eyes. "That hurt more than anything," Linda said. He'd always been my anchor, the person I trusted to see me clearly. Now he stared at his hands as if the truth might be written there. My aunt chimed in next, saying she'd been worried too. She mentioned that I hadn't come to the last family dinner and that she'd heard I was struggling. Struggling with what, no one could quite say. But they all seemed convinced it was something serious. I finally opened my mouth. "Why didn't anyone talk to me first?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Linda smiled, soft and patient. Because when someone is overwhelmed, they don't always realize it, she said. This way, you don't feel attacked by one person. The irony almost made me laugh. I was being cornered by 5. They talked about Mark next. Linda said she was concerned he was isolating me, encouraging me to spend less time with my family, influencing my decisions. My cousin nodded, saying he'd noticed I'd changed since I started dating him. I felt heat rise in my chest. Mark had done nothing but support me. He'd never once spoken badly about my family. But Linda framed it as concern, and concern is hard to argue against without looking defensive. Here's the part that still makes my stomach twist. Linda suggested I take a break from certain relationships, including Mark and a few close friends, until I was in a healthier place. She said it would help me reconnect with my family and rediscover who I really was. My dad finally spoke up then, saying maybe some distance wouldn't hurt. That's when I realized how deeply her version of events had sunk in. I said no, quietly, but firmly. I told them I wasn't isolated, I was busy, I wasn't manipulated, I was in love. I wasn't struggling, I was growing. The room went cold. Linda's smile tightened. She said my reaction proved her point, that resistance was common when someone didn't want to face reality. My aunt sighed and said they just wanted what was best for me. That night, after I left, my phone started lighting up. Messages from relatives asking if I was okay, if I'd thought about what was said, if I was ready to accept help. Someone had already framed my refusal as denial. I called Mark, shaking, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then asked one simple question. What do you want? No one else had asked me that. Over the next few weeks, Linda tightened her grip. She called my dad daily, updating him on my supposed progress or lack thereof. She told relatives I was pushing everyone away. Invitations stopped coming. Group chats went quiet when I spoke. Slowly, carefully, she made it seem like the distance was my choice. That's when I realized the intervention wasn't a one-time event. It was the beginning of an isolation campaign. Linda didn't need to forbid anyone from seeing me. She just needed to convince them I was unstable, ungrateful, or difficult. People backed away on their own. And my dad, stuck between his wife and his daughter, chose the path of least resistance. I started documenting everything, every text, every conversation, every subtle comment that painted me as a problem to be managed. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but something inside me knew I'd need proof. Because one thing was becoming painfully clear. If I didn't tell my own story, Linda would finish telling it for me. By the end of that month, I was lonelier than I'd ever been, even with people technically still in my life. But loneliness has a way of sharpening your vision. And once I saw what was happening, I couldn't unsee it. That's when I decided I was done being quiet. That decision didn't make me brave overnight. It made me scared. There's a difference. Standing up for yourself sounds powerful in theory, but in practice, it often means standing alone first. The more I pulled back from Linda's narrative, the more obvious it became how much of my family communication flowed through her. If she didn't pass something along, it simply didn't exist. And suddenly, I barely existed at all. I tested it one evening by calling my dad directly. Not texting, not going through Linda, just calling. He sounded surprised to hear from me, like I was a distant relative instead of his daughter. We talked awkwardly about small things, work, the weather. Then I asked him why no one had invited me to my aunt's birthday dinner. There was a pause. He said he thought I didn't want to come. That Linda had said I needed space and didn't like the pressure of family gatherings right now. That night changed everything. I realized Linda wasn't just speaking about me, she was speaking for me. Making decisions on my behalf, filtering information, shaping how others perceived my absence. And the worst part was how reasonable it all sounded when she explained it. Who argues with someone who says they're respecting your boundaries? I confronted her a week later. I asked her calmly why she told people I didn't want to be included. She sighed and said she was protecting me from stress, from judgment, from expectations. You're sensitive, Emily, she said gently. You always have been. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked her to stop. I told her I could speak for myself. She looked genuinely offended. She said I was attacking her character after everything she'd done for this family. She said I was ungrateful. She said she'd never imagined I could be so cruel. And just like that, the conversation flipped. Suddenly, I was the aggressor, the problem, the one causing pain. Here's where things got even messier. Linda told my dad I'd lashed out at her, that I was unstable and emotional, that she was worried I might be spiraling. She suggested therapy, but not as support, as supervision. She framed it as something the family needed to help me through this phase. My dad called me that night, voice tight, asking if I was okay, asking if I needed help. I asked him if he believed her. He didn't answer. I started leaning more heavily on Mark and a couple of close friends. They reminded me who I was when I wasn't being constantly questioned. They asked me how I felt instead of telling me how I should feel. That contrast made everything painfully clear. Love doesn't confuse you. Control does. Linda noticed the shift immediately. She told my dad my friends were enabling me. She said Mark was encouraging distance. She said I was surrounding myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear. The irony was exhausting. For the first time in my life, I was being truly honest about my feelings, and that honesty was being labeled dangerous. One afternoon, my aunt called me directly. Her voice was hesitant. She asked if I was angry with the family. I asked her why she thought that. She admitted Linda had said I needed space because I felt misunderstood and overwhelmed. I took a deep breath and told her the truth, that I had never asked for space, that I felt excluded, that I felt spoken over. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't know, my aunt said quietly. That conversation cracked something open. Over the next few days, 2 more relatives reached out privately. They asked careful questions. They listened. And for the first time, Linda's version of events wasn't the only one in the room. She sensed it immediately. Her messages became colder, shorter. She stopped pretending this was about concern. The next family gathering invitation came with conditions. Linda said it would be best if Mark didn't attend. She said it might be too much for everyone. That was the moment I stopped negotiating. I declined the invitation entirely. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I just said no. The fallout was immediate. I was accused of tearing the family apart, of choosing an outsider over blood, of being selfish. But beneath all that noise was something new, clarity. I finally understood that Linda's goal was never unity. It was access and control. And the only way to keep both was to make sure I stayed isolated. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Saying no felt like stepping off a cliff, but instead of falling, I found solid ground. It was shaky at first. My phone stayed silent for days after I declined the invitation. No one checked in to ask how I was. No one asked why. Linda didn't need to say anything anymore. The message was clear. Compliance meant belonging. Resistance meant exile. I grieved that realization more than I expected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet moments. Standing in line at the grocery store, driving past my childhood neighborhood, folding laundry alone on a Sunday afternoon. I mourned the version of family I thought I had, the one that showed up when things got uncomfortable. I had spent years believing that if I just explained myself better, loved harder, stayed calmer, everything would work out. Now I understood that explanation was never the issue. Mark watched all of this with a mix of anger and restraint. He never told me what to do. He never spoke badly about my family unless I asked him directly. One night, after I'd vented for nearly an hour, he said something that stuck with me. If someone really wanted to understand you, he said, they'd ask questions, not build cases. That sentence replayed in my head every time Linda claimed she was just concerned. The breaking point came unexpectedly. My dad called me late one evening, his voice strained. He asked if we could meet alone without Linda. I agreed, cautiously. We met at a small diner halfway between our apartments. He looked older somehow, more tired. After some awkward small talk, he finally admitted he felt caught in the middle. He said Linda was hurt. He said the family felt divided.
He asked if there was any way I could just make peace.
I asked him a simple question. Dad, do you think I'm capable of making my own decisions? He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose sides. I was asking him to choose truth. To listen to me without filtering it through someone else. He nodded, but I could see fear behind his eyes. Confronting Linda would mean conflict, and conflict was something he had avoided his entire life. That's when I understood something painful but freeing. My stepmother's power didn't come from her manipulation alone. It came from everyone else's silence. From their willingness to let her speak because it was easier than pushing back. Including my father. That realization hurt, but it also shifted something inside me. I stopped waiting for him to rescue me from the situation. I stopped hoping he'd suddenly see clearly and fix everything. Instead, I focused on building a life that didn't revolve around their approval. I spent more time with friends who knew me before the narrative. I poured myself into work. I started therapy on my own terms, not because someone suggested it as a corrective measure, but because I wanted clarity and strength. My therapist helped me name what had happened. Emotional manipulation, triangulation, isolation. Hearing those words out loud felt like turning on a light in a dark room. Linda noticed the change, of course. She reached out after weeks of silence with a carefully worded message about wanting to reset and move forward. She suggested a family meeting to clear the air. The old me would have agreed immediately, desperate for resolution. This time I set conditions. I said I'd meet, but only if everyone spoke for themselves, and no one interrupted. No summaries. No speaking on my behalf. The meeting was tense. Linda tried to control the conversation early, but I stopped her, calmly, firmly. I said, I can explain my own feelings. The room went quiet. For the first time, she didn't have the floor. I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully. I told them how it felt to be talked about instead of talked to be excluded under the guise of protection, to be treated like a problem to manage instead of a person to understand. Some people looked uncomfortable. My aunt cried. My cousin stared at the table. My dad listened, really listened, for the first time in a long while. Linda stayed composed, but I could see the cracks. When it was her turn to speak, she framed everything as misunderstandings. She said she only ever wanted what was best. She said she felt attacked. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The difference was obvious now. When the meeting ended, nothing was magically fixed. But something important had changed. The story was no longer one-sided. People had heard me. They might not all agree with me, but they couldn't pretend I hadn't spoken. And for me, that was enough. I left knowing one thing for certain. I didn't need to be included at the cost of my voice. If belonging required my silence, it wasn't belonging at all. The days after the meeting were quieter than I expected. No dramatic apologies, no sudden shift in behavior. But the silence felt different this time, like the calm after a storm where something has fundamentally changed in the air. I wasn't waiting anymore for validation or recognition from my family. I was waiting for myself. I returned to the studio with a new focus. Each rehearsal, each step, each turn became a practice not just in dance but in presence. I moved differently, not for applause or approval, but to feel my own strength in my body. I noticed subtle changes. I could hold a pose longer, extend a movement further, not because I had to prove anything, but because it simply felt good. Friends noticed too. Emma, my oldest friend, pulled me aside one afternoon. You're lighter, Chloe. You walk like someone finally let go of a weight they didn't realize they were carrying. I smiled, though my throat felt tight. She was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding the tension of others' expectations in my shoulders. I was carrying only myself. Linda sent messages occasionally, polite and measured. She never asked for permission to visit or to be included in my life. She didn't try to control me anymore. I realized she had lost the leverage she once wielded so effortlessly, the leverage of my silence. My family had always counted on my quiet compliance. Now they faced the full, unfiltered me. And that scared them more than any confrontation could have. Therapy became a sanctuary. Talking to someone impartial allowed me to untangle decades of subtle manipulation and guilt. I learned to set boundaries not as punishment, but as protection. I learned to distinguish love from convenience, empathy from obligation. And slowly I stopped expecting apologies or acknowledgement from those who hadn't been there. I didn't need them anymore not to survive, not to feel whole. The final test came unexpectedly. My father called me one morning. His voice was quiet, almost tentative. Chloe, would you like to come over for dinner this weekend? Just us, I paused, considering. There was no pressure in his tone, no attempt to control, no guilt layered under the invitation. Just a choice. I said yes. And when I arrived, it wasn't about forgiveness or rebuilding the old dynamics. It was about practicing something new: presence, honesty, and mutual respect. Linda wasn't there. My dad didn't try to fill the space she would have occupied with platitudes. We talked like adults, like human beings trying to navigate a complicated history without erasing it. And for the first time, that felt enough. I realized then that choosing myself didn't mean cutting everyone else out of my life. It meant refusing to sacrifice my voice, my well-being, or my truth for the comfort of others. Choosing myself meant walking into the unknown with the confidence that, no matter what, I would still be standing. The scar on my abdomen remains, a quiet reminder of the day my body and my family betrayed me. But the stronger scar, the one etched deep in my sense of self, tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman who refused to be invisible, who refused to be convenient, who refused to allow the voices of others to dictate her worth. And as I lie in bed at night, reflecting on the path I've carved out for myself, I know this much: I am finally, unequivocally, chosen by me.